And so, you know, I've moved on, but a lot of the foolish haven't, and they're still stuck there. And that explains Green Day. There's a band that haven't come up with anything in their own. What they literally are is a coat hanger with a studded leather jacket stuck on it. All right? And I think it's a parody and it's a shame.
John Lydon just dropped a bombshell, and it's brutal. At 69, the Sex Pistols frontman didn't hold back, naming the three bands he hated the most. Known for his sharp tongue and fearless honesty, Lydon revealed the musicians who truly got under his skin. Fans were stunned by his choices, and the reasons behind his disdain are even more shocking. Green Day punk rock has always been a movement defined as much by attitude as by sound, a furious reaction against complacency, commercialism, and uniformity in music and culture. For its pioneers, punk was a manifesto of rebellion, a way to assert individuality while smashing preconceptions about music and society. So when a band emerges claiming punk credentials decades later, the question naturally arises: do they embody the spirit of the movement, or are they simply borrowing its iconography for profit? Few have been as blunt in answering that question as John Lydon, the irascible frontman of the Sex Pistols, who has never been shy about expressing disdain for bands he deems fraudulent or derivative. Lydon has been particularly scathing toward Green Day, the American pop-punk powerhouse that, for better or worse, brought punk-infused music to stadiums around the world. To Lydon, Green Day's brand of punk is hollow and, frankly, laughable. "It's embarrassing," he said in one interview, capturing the essence of his critique. "There are so many bands like Green Day now. When I see them, I can't help but laugh. They're just imitators, a dull version of something that isn't truly theirs." In Lydon's eyes, Green Day and their contemporaries are not simply continuing a tradition. They are performing a calculated exercise in nostalgia, dressing up punk aesthetics while delivering music that lacks the edge, unpredictability, and raw honesty that defined the original movement. What makes Lydon's critique particularly sharp is his unwillingness to acknowledge Green Day's commercial success or even the political undertones of some of their work. In interviews with major publications, including the New York Times, Lydon has elaborated on his perspective. He questioned the band's authenticity outright. "I look at them, and I just have to laugh. They're coat hangers, you know, a turgid version of something that doesn't actually belong to them." The metaphor is deliberate. Rotten portrays Green Day as mere vessels, hangers for a scene they never truly lived or experienced. In essence, he argues, the band is wearing the trappings of punk without ever inhabiting its core values. For Lydon, punk is inseparable from its origins as a fiercely independent DIY culture. The Sex Pistols were never about technical perfection or chart success. They were about raw expression, shock value, and the audacious belief that anyone could disrupt the system. Lydon has often emphasized that true punk is self-defined and ungoverned by conventions. It is a refusal to follow trends, a commitment to personal integrity and unpolished creativity. By contrast, he sees Green Day as a formulaic enterprise. They have a sound engineered to appeal to mass audiences, carefully curated images designed to sell merchandise and fill arenas. Punk, in Lydon's conception, was never meant to be profitable. It was meant to be disruptive. Lydon's disapproval extends beyond musical style to philosophical differences over what punk should represent. While Green Day occasionally engages with political themes, songs about disenfranchisement, anti-establishment rhetoric, and critiques of American politics, Lydon regards these gestures as superficial. Punk, for him, was never about checking off political boxes or adopting revolutionary language. It was about doing things on your own terms, breaking with uniformity, and creating something genuinely new. He has consistently derided bands that maintain cliches and uniformity under the guise of rebellion, suggesting that much of contemporary punk, including Green Day, misses the point entirely. To him, rebellion cannot be packaged, sold, or mass-produced. There is also an undeniable generational element in Lydon's critique. Punk, in its heyday during the late 1970s, was an insurgent force, raw, unpredictable, and unapologetic. It challenged established norms not only in music but in culture at large, from fashion to political discourse. Lydon's attachment to this era colors his judgment of newer bands, who he sees as inheriting a mantle they have no claim to. His scorn for Green Day is as much about nostalgia for a scene he led as it is about the band itself. He champions a vision of punk that, in his eyes, cannot exist outside the crucible of the late 70s London and New York underground scenes, where survival, defiance, and authenticity were inseparable from artistic output. Yet, despite the harshness of his words, Lydon's critique invites a broader conversation about punk's evolution. Green Day's success, bringing punk-adjacent sounds to mainstream audiences, filling arenas, and influencing younger musicians, suggests that the spirit of punk can take many forms, even if they are sanitized for mass consumption. Lydon, however, would likely argue that commercial viability is the antithesis of punk. For him, the movement's essence cannot be replicated or monetized. It must be lived. And Green Day, like many bands in the post-1990s era, does not meet that standard. The Clash. The Clash, often hailed as one of punk rock's most politically conscious bands, have long been celebrated for their fusion of raw musical energy and social commentary. Yet, to John Lydon, the mercurial frontman of the Sex Pistols, and a man whose own approach to punk was defined by unflinching honesty and confrontational authenticity, the band's reputation for political depth was, in many ways, overrated. In his memoir, Energy, My Life Uncensored, Lydon delivers a candid critique of The Clash, arguing that beneath their revolutionary image, their music lacked substance and, ultimately, credibility. Lydon's central objection to The Clash revolves around what he perceives as a disconnect between their lyrical content and the lived realities of its members. While the band's songs often tackled themes of social injustice, class struggle, and anti-establishment sentiment, Lydon contends that the messages were largely abstract, devoid of actionable meaning, and sometimes hypocritical. Their songs didn't seem to stand for very much at all, Lydon writes, underscoring his frustration with what he considered superficial rhetoric. In particular, he characterizes much of the Clash's material as a form of abstract socialism, grandiose statements of principle that rarely translated into authenticity or personal accountability. This critique extends beyond mere lyrical skepticism. Lydon asserts that the Clash offered little in terms of character development, an essential component, he believes, for any band claiming to represent countercultural or revolutionary ideals. To Lydon, punk was not merely about slogans or social critique. It was about demonstrating integrity through actions, attitudes, and lifestyle. A band could not simply wear political symbolism or espouse class consciousness and call it punk. Authenticity, in Lydon's view, required alignment between rhetoric and lived experience, a standard he felt The Clash failed to meet. Joe Strummer, the charismatic frontman of The Clash, is central to Lydon's critique. While Lydon expresses personal admiration for Strummer's talent and charisma, he also highlights contradictions in Strummer's persona. He began to lack a sense of humor about himself, Lydon observes, suggesting that Strummer's image became increasingly self-important over time. He was definitely out to grab himself a crown. Lydon implies that Strummer's political messaging, while rhetorically potent, was inextricably intertwined with a pursuit of personal recognition and fame. To Lydon, Strummer's revolutionary statements risked feeling performative rather than authentic, a concern for someone who placed punk's value on sincerity over spectacle. The issue of authenticity for Lydon is compounded by socioeconomic context. Lydon repeatedly emphasizes the tension between the Clash's proclamations of class struggle and the members' relatively comfortable backgrounds. He writes, "Some of the things the Clash said really clashed with my sense of integrity. talking about class war while living in a mansion. Here, Lydon identifies a fundamental contradiction. Social critique loses weight when it emerges from a position of privilege. To him, the credibility of punk's message is inseparable from the credibility of the messenger, and Strummer's upbringing, in Lydon's estimation, undercut the band's revolutionary posture. Yet, Lydon's critique is not without nuance. He explicitly separates his personal feelings about Strummer from his assessment of the Clash's music. "No, forget it. I like Joe personally. He needed to be more genuine with us than that," Lydon clarifies. This distinction illustrates that his disapproval is not rooted in envy or personal animosity, but in a rigorous standard for artistic and ideological integrity. Punk, in Lydon's philosophy, is a measure of honesty and self-consistency, and the Clash, despite their talents and ambitions, often fell short in this critical regard. Lydon's skepticism toward the Clash also reflects a broader generational and philosophical divide within punk itself. The Sex Pistols' approach to the movement was irreverent, confrontational, and fundamentally grounded in lived experience rather than ideology. For Lydon, punk was a vehicle for immediate visceral expression, not a platform for theorizing about society from a detached vantage point. In this context, the Clash's earnest political messaging can appear overwrought or insincere, particularly when paired with Strummer's evolving celebrity persona and the band's financial success. Lydon suggests that the real spirit of punk is found not in grandiose proclamations, but in small acts of defiance, self-determination, and authenticity. Another dimension of Lydon's critique involves humor and self-awareness. In his eyes, the ability to mock oneself and recognize one's limitations is a cornerstone of credibility, particularly in a movement as subversive as punk. The absence of this humility in Strummer, coupled with the performative nature of the Clash's political posturing, undermined the sincerity of their message. While many fans revered the Clash for their political commitment and broad musical experimentation, Lydon remained unconvinced that the band's public persona matched their private reality, leaving him skeptical of their contribution to punk's ethical core. Guns N' Roses. The Sex Pistols' frontman, Johnny Rotten, also known as John Lydon, has never been one to mince words when it comes to his opinions about music and authenticity. Known for his sharp tongue and uncompromising standards, Rotten has long been critical of artists who, in his view, compromise the core principles of rock and roll for fame, commercial success, or image management. Among the targets of his scorn is one of the most famous American hard rock bands of the late 1980s and early 1990s, Guns N' Roses. In particular, Lydon's disdain has often been directed at the band's notoriously volatile frontman, Axl Rose. Rotten's criticism of Guns N' Roses is rooted in his broader philosophy that rock and roll is defined above all by authenticity. In a 1989 interview, he articulated this point with characteristic bluntness. "I don't want them to accept me in any shape or form because I despise them so much, and I don't want a pat on the back from Phil Collins. That would be the worst possible insult. I don't want to be rubbing shoulders with Guns N' Roses at some Rock and Roll Hall of Fame awards ceremony, congratulating each other." Here, Lydon makes it clear that his disdain is not superficial. It is moral and artistic, tied to a belief that Guns N' Roses represents everything that, in his eyes, undermines the integrity of rock music. To him, proximity to the band, even in a ceremonial context, would feel like a betrayal of his own values. This critique is not merely personal. It extends to Guns N' Roses' entire approach to music and public persona. Lydon has repeatedly emphasized that rock and roll's essence lies in sincerity, emotional truth, and direct communication with audiences. Bands that prioritize image, spectacle, or commercial positioning over these elements are, in his view, failing the very foundation of the art form. Guns N' Roses, with their bombastic productions, larger-than-life persona, and highly choreographed public image, epitomized, for Lydon, the commercialization of rock and roll. Theirs was a music scene where rebellion had been commodified, danger had been sanitized for mass audiences, and the edginess of hard rock had become a brand rather than a lived experience. Rotten's frustrations with Axl Rose, in particular, are emblematic of this critique. During a conversation in the 1990s in which he also spoke critically of Courtney Love, Lydon singled out Rose's behavior as emblematic of what he perceives as a lack of integrity in modern rock. "From the very beginning, rock and roll has been about authenticity," he stated, emphasizing that the connection between artist and audience is predicated on honesty. He went on to describe a scenario in which he attempted to engage Rose directly, only to be rebuffed with what he viewed as a flimsy excuse. "Axl Rose, his mediocre excuse for not talking to me is that he's in the studio recording. This is a man who claims to love my singing style. You're a fraud, and I'm underwhelmed." The contradiction between professed admiration and actual behavior for Lydon encapsulates everything that is wrong with the band's approach to rock. Axl Rose, in this telling, is a performer more concerned with image management and self-promotion than genuine artistic dialogue. At the heart of Lydon's critique is the principle that rock and roll should be confrontational, risky, and emotionally transparent. Guns N' Roses, by contrast, represented a version of the genre that was polished, market-driven, and reliant on myth-making. Lydon, whose own career began with the intentionally abrasive and raw aesthetic of the Sex Pistols, viewed this shift as a betrayal of rock's original ethos. While Guns N' Roses were undoubtedly talented musicians, Lydon perceived their public persona and behavior as emblematic of a broader cultural problem: the commercialization of rebellion and the sanitization of authenticity. In other words, while their records sold millions and their concerts filled stadiums, their music and image lacked the credibility that Lydon believes is essential to rock's moral and artistic foundation. Rotten's disdain also reflects his skepticism toward celebrity culture within the music industry. For Lydon, the rock star who prioritizes fame over substance, image over integrity, or spectacle over sincerity, cannot claim allegiance to the principles of punk or rock and roll. Guns N' Roses, with their headline-grabbing antics, notorious feuds, and highly publicized lifestyle, represented exactly the kind of band that Lydon considers antithetical to the art form. His critique is as much a rejection of their attitude as it is a critique of their music, a moral judgment embedded in aesthetic evaluation. Furthermore, Lydon's comments underscore a recurring theme in his career: a zero-tolerance approach to what he perceives as hypocrisy or insincerity. In his worldview, professing admiration while failing to act in good faith, or claiming to embody the rebellious spirit of rock while adhering to commercial formulas, is unforgivable. The rebuff from Rose, combined with the band's ostentatious image, became emblematic of a larger problem: the dilution of rock and punk ideals in favor of profitability and spectacle. For Lydon, the authenticity of rock is inseparable from the honesty of the individual, both in music and in personal interactions, and Guns N' Roses failed this test in his eyes. What do you think about 3 bands that John Lydon especially hates? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.